Hey everyone, welcome back to diabetesdietguy.com. I'm Mark Green, specialist diabetes dietitian. If you're watching on YouTube, then welcome. If you're watching on the blog, then pleasure to have you. And today is off the back of a question I was asked about type 1 diabetes and how to manage exercise. Now, spoiler, this is not going to be an all-encompassing video on how to manage exercise type 1 diabetes because it's very, very difficult. And actually you need specialist input to sit down with someone to see how you respond, particularly to your own levels. And also there are algorithms that we can punch in regards to how much carbs to eat, how much to reduce your insulin by. But the purpose of this video is to just give you the basics and look at some things to think about if you're not already thinking about them. So here's our graph. Typical day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, into the evening. 24-hour insulin, that's your background insulin, there's your basal insulin. Here, we've got your bolus insulins, that's going to be your rapid insulin. This one lasts 24 hours, this one lasts 4.5 hours. Now, first thing to think about is when is the exercise in your day? Because if it is here in the morning, before you've had any insulin, this is the most reproducible time to see what your glucose levels do because you have the least insulin in your system. There's no rapid insulin here at this point. So it's one less variable to think about. So actually then we can start to think about in terms of carb and how to prevent hypos. That's quite an easy one to manage. Usually we're working on somewhere between 20 to 60 grams of carb per hour to prevent hypos, but it's going to depend on your intensity and duration in terms of how much you will need, okay? Kind of like little mini hypo treatments, so you're not taking on a huge amount. Usually best in a liquid form because it's easy to get it in. Okay, but keep in mind that depending on what you're doing, this exercise is going to have a prolonged effect, likely well into lunch. So that means that you might need to reduce this dose and possibly this dose, and depending on what you're doing, you might need to reduce this dose too. So we usually always start with the rapid insulin reductions first before we start messing around with the basal insulin, the background insulin. This is assuming, of course, you're not on pump. This is a different beast and much more flexible. So this is when you're having subcutaneous injections. So usually we say how much to reduce by. Depends on the intensity, but it might be anywhere between 0 and even withholding it completely, 100% maybe. But let's start with 0 to 50% if it's under 30 minutes or 30 minutes to 60 minutes perhaps, and if it's over 60 minutes you might want to be going 50% plus, just as a rule of thumb. So that's if it's here. But what starts happening then if you're exercising within the action of your insulin dose? If it's planned exercise, you know that you can reduce this dose preemptively to counteract for the exercise to prevent the hypo later. But of course that's going to mean that you're going to get a slight spike beforehand. If you're okay with that, you can be satisfied that it's going to drop later. If you're not okay with that, then it might be a case of taking a full insulin dose, but then you're going to have to really think about your carbohydrate intake to prevent the hypos. Okay, so again, we can eat, or we can adjust, or we can do a combination of both. Now, let's say it's not planned exercise. So you go into work, but you have a busy day ahead, but you've not realized it yet. So you might be loading trucks and things, and it can be quite variable. In that case, you can't reduce the insulin preemptively because you don't know it's coming, in which case it's about taking on board these carbohydrates, quick releasing carbohydrates, 20 to 60 grams per hour, and making sure you're testing regularly. But then, of course, keep in mind that there's going to be a prolonged effect. So at the next meal, you might need to repeat this process, reduce the insulin by anywhere between 0 and 50% plus of your mealtime dose, and then test as well to make sure that you're not falling into that hypo territory. Now, the one tricky one that is really quite difficult to manage is evening exercise. And the reason is that if the hypo's to come, it's going to come overnight, likely when you're asleep. Of course, you can reduce this insulin as well to stop the hypo coming. And one thing to think about overnight is at what point did the hypo come if it did? So is it in the early part of the evening or overnight? So let's say anywhere between, depending on your bedtime, let's say between 10 and 2 a.m., in which case it's most likely related to this dose, in which case we need to further reduce it. Or is it more in the latter part of your sleep, so sort of going into the morning, in which case it might be more of a gradual decline, which would indicate then is the background insulin that might need changing. But the problem is with changing this insulin is as long as the exercise effect is happening, yes, you'll prevent the hypo because you've got less insulin in your body, but once the exercise is worn off, what will happen is the next day is your glucose levels will want to rise because you've not got your basal insulin correct for you at that time. So actually here, before bed, I'd probably have a bedtime snack. Ideally slower releasing carbohydrates, so we're not going for the quick releasing ones this time. Maybe 20 to 30 grams, a slice of bread or two, a banana, a glass of milk to give you some carbs to stop you dropping low, whilst also reducing this dose to not drive you too low at the early hours of the night. Okay. Now I appreciate you doing it from a weight management perspective, then eating is not exactly what you want to do because you're exercising to lose weight and then you're having to eat more. It's not a tremendous amount of calories that you need to do this with. Banana's about 100, 200 mils of milk is going to be somewhere around 100 calories, but I get the point that it's difficult. So it might be thinking about actually, can I move this exercise session elsewhere? Or if you're doing it regularly, is it an indication for even pump therapy? And that way you can then start to adjust your basal rates hour by hour pretty much. So it is tricky, I'm not going to lie. I guess the other thing is to think about is how often are you exercising, because it becomes quite tricky to manage when you're sporadic with it. So let's say you do exercise twice a week. So now suddenly you've got 2 days a week when you're going to be much more sensitive to your insulin and you're burning up carbohydrate and fuel and glucose, which then means you're going to have to start playing around with your insulins and snacking and carbing. And then on the other days, your insulin requirements are going to go back up. So then you almost have exercise days and non-exercise days. Whereas if you're consistently exercising, let's say it's 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, actually what you'll find is your insulin requirements are just your insulin requirements because you're not having to adjust it because it's so repeatable that you know what you need to take because the exercise is doing its thing and you're doing your thing. So it's when you start getting inconsistency that you'll see the variability. Not to say you have to go to the gym or exercise 5 days a week if that's not what you want to do, but the more regularly you do it, the more repeatable it is, the easier it becomes to manage, which hopefully makes sense. So just a few things to think about there. So really it's about timing of the exercise, the duration of that effect and making sure you're testing your levels to find out that. We can eat extra carbohydrates, 20 to 60 grams per hour to try and offset hypos. You might need more, you might need less. Insulin reduction starting with the bolus rapid insulin first and foremost, but perhaps you might want to look at this basal insulin, but it does come with problems if you start fiddling around with this for exercise outside of a pump, unless it's a daily thing, but in which case your background insulin will just be what you need because you're exercising, therefore that will just be a standard dose then because there's no variability, it's every day. So just some things to think about really, and I hope that's useful. Like I say, there's a lot of other things you need to go into, but really you need to look at the numbers and the glucose levels. So let me know if you have any questions about it. Like I say, I'm always happy to try and respond to all the questions that I get if you post them below on the YouTube, but also in the Facebook page, which is where I'm more likely to pick them up. Do ask the questions because if you have them, someone else will likely have them as well. So I'll leave it there. Hope it's useful. Let me know any questions. See you later.